Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly training webcast here at NCSI. It's a special one today. It's a pizza webcast. I'm John Bartz with Network Consulting Services, and this month's topic is Windows 10 migration. With me today is Bryan Hadzik, our lead technologist, who will be running through a live demonstration using the Ivanti solutions. Welcome, Bryan. Good morning.
Sound check. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. This is a deep dive Win 10 migration training session, so we thought we'd send along a pizza and make it a lunch and learn today. It's going to be a little bit longer. The pizzas should have arrived at 11:30 local time or will arrive at 11:30 local time. If you have any issues with that, go ahead and pop something in the Q&A or email us afterwards. We'll make sure we get that to you. But they should be landing here shortly for most of you if they haven't already. Feel free to use the Q&A function throughout today's training, and we'll get to those questions as we go. So let's dive right into it. Bryan, floor is yours. Take it away.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. January 14th, 2020. Does everyone have that date on their calendar? If they don't, they should. Why? That's the Windows 7 end-of-life date. You know, it's a lot closer than you think. It's barely 2 years away. It's, you know, as a matter of fact, it's 788 days, 12 hours, 28 minutes, and 22 seconds away from today. That time is going to go a lot faster than we think. So hopefully we're going to talk about today how we're going to, over the next 788 days, help you get migrated over to Windows 10. Just like John said, from a Q&A perspective, please ask questions as we go along. No one wants to just hear me ramble on and read slides for many hours. So please ask the questions as we go along. I'll try and keep it very interactive and adapt to what you guys actually want to see. Today we're talking about Ivanti products, but NCSI actually supports many other products. Here's just kind of a quick slide of what they are. Companies like ForcePoint, Imperva, CyberArk, Palo Alto Networks, Okta, ServiceNow, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, Veeam, and VMware. So if you have interest in those other products, we do the same kind of webinars for those other products as well. I have a question for you. What kind of deployment do you think Windows 10 is going to happen? How you're going to do it in your environment? I open up a poll. It's going to pop up on your screen. It's going to ask you whether you're going to be doing an in-place upgrade, a hardware replacement, a combination. You're not sure. Please just pick which one you plan on doing in your organization. If you're not sure, you can put I don't know. And there's even a subset of that in-place upgrade. Are we doing a upgrade of the operating system where we actually upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10, or are we going to wipe it out and reinstall it with, a wipe and fresh install? Or are we going the hardware replacement route where we are going to buy brand new machines and we're just going to simply migrate the users from one machine to the next, and that new machine just happens to have Windows 10. So I'm going to close the poll here, and about 15 seconds from now, I'll be able to show you the results. It looks like a good chunk of most people are saying that they are going to be doing both, kind of a combination of an in-place upgrade and a hardware replacement. I'm not too surprised. That seems pretty typical considering we're kind of in the middle of hardware replacement cycles and so forth, and there's a lot of external drivers. We can't necessarily make these decisions in a vacuum. So looks like we're doing, both. We need to talk about both and have both ways of doing it in our portfolio. So let's kind of talk about those a little bit more in depth. Okay, so what are the components of the migration? Let's break it down into three general components. At the top, we have the user data. In the middle, we have the applications, and at the bottom, we have the operating system. I think the most difficult one is the user data, and then the applications and the operating system is actually the easiest one. So let's start out with the easy conversation on the operating system, and we'll kind of go from there. What we're going to be talking about today, a way to solve getting a new operating system on your machines, is using the provisioning product inside of Endpoint Manager. Quick flash for anyone that hasn't paid attention, recently LANdesk changed its name to Ivanti, and the product that you've maybe known in the past as LANdesk Management Suite is now actually Ivanti Endpoint Manager. It's essentially the same product, just maybe some rebranding and a couple of new features and so forth. So if you used LDMS in the past, that's the product that we're talking about today. Provisioning has been around in the product for quite some time. It's matured pretty well over about the past 10 years or so to be a very, very robust tool we're going to be using it as the orchestration for the entire process. So even when we get to migrating the user data, we get to migrating the applications, provisioning is still going to play a pretty big part in that. So what do I need to have set up in advance to use provisioning? Well, there's a couple of things. We need to make sure that you have your PXE environment correct. That's the pre-execution environment, so that we can get into a temporary operating system and do our imaging. We need to worry about the image itself of the operating system. We need to worry about the drivers for hardware-independent imaging, because we don't want to have 37 different images for the 37 different hardware platforms that we have today. So we need to dive into those three components. From a version perspective, I'm going to be showing you today the latest version, and that's Ivanti's Endpoint Manager 2017.3. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. You're not technically required to be on the latest version. I recommend that you get upgraded because we have a lot of improvements and so forth in the product, but you can technically do a lot of this stuff with years old version, even when it is Windows 10. So I'm just going to be showing you the latest today with 2017.3. Okay, PXE prerequisites. For those who used PXE in the past, it went under a fundamental change recently with the self-electing platform. What does that mean? In the past, you would go and choose a machine to be a PXE representative. You would say, this machine right here, I want to be a PXE representative. And it was very specific, very calculated. Now, what we're doing is the self-electing platform does more than just PXE. It's going to do things like agentless discovery and agent state and device discovery. And so how you configure that is here in our Ivanti Endpoint Manager console, we have the self-electing subnet services. So it's going to find the various subnets that your devices live on. In my case, I just have one. This is 10.2.1.0. You need to right-click on this and say Enable. What that's going to do is that's going to make its own user decision to decide who should be the PXE representative in that particular subnet. You can see mine that I've enabled it as a current state, or the desired state is enabled, and the current state is enabled because it elected the device called UWM-Win7-1 to be my particular PXE representative. So that's who's doing the PXE on my network. So make sure that that is on and enabled. You can configure some settings here to say, for example, what you want with new subnets. If we find a new subnet, should we automatically turn on PXE, for example, so you don't have to go and manually select it. You can kind of choose how that's set up. Next, you need to have preferred servers set up. Now, preferred servers is often used when we have multiple locations. If we have a branch office, we just have a separate location, and we don't want to be pulling the images or packages or patches from the core server across the WAN every single time. However, it's actually a requirement now, a couple of versions ago, to use that even when you're imaging, even in the same subnet like I am doing today. So it's relatively simple to set up. You come in here to the content replication, go into preferred servers, create a preferred server. My server name is IEM, so it's the server itself. You just put in username and password that you're going to use to be able to be connecting to it. You put in an IP address range of the devices that are going to use this preferred server. This is where if it was in a different location, you would maybe put in that location's subnet. Here it's just my local subnet. And then under sources, you need to put the actual share. In this case, it's a UNC path. I've created a UNC path called images. It's nothing exciting. Here on the C drive of my server, I've gone into shares, and I've created a simple share called images. Now, you don't have to do this on your core server if you don't want to. You can do it on a file server, on a NAS, on your workstation. I don't care where this repository lives. It just needs to exist somewhere and be a share. So those are my images share, and I've set a username and password to be able to talk to that. And then there's also write credentials. We need to do that when we're like capturing the image because we actually need to write to that particular share. So you need to make sure you have your preferred servers set up, but now, especially with the self-electing stuff, I mean, you can set those up in a matter of 5 or 10 minutes. Again, look for that current state to be set to enable before we start doing PXE. Okay, so next we need to talk about the image. The image is a very interesting part of our process, but in the end, it's really irrelevant which one of these two we choose. We have two primary platforms that we can choose from an actual image creation and deployment. One of them is ImageW. ImageW is built into the Ivanti Endpoint Manager product. You get it for free when you buy the product. It's installed with the core server. It's very simple. It's very easy to use. It's a traditional block level capture, so it captures the entire partition, you know, the master boot record. All of that information is grabbed off of the hard drive, and we store that information on the server. The only con really to ImageW is it still follows that classic mentality that if you want to go and update it, you need to go and maybe spit it back out, apply some updates, make some changes, and then recapture that image. Another alternative that we have is ImageX. ImageX, for those that aren't familiar, is the WIM format that Microsoft uses, and they use it all day long. As a matter of fact, when you go to install Windows these days, you know, I think it was Windows Vista maybe, or later, maybe it was Windows 7, it actually applies an image. It applies a WIM with the ImageX product. And so it's a Microsoft standard. There's no cost associated with it. You can, you know, download all the tools for free off the website to be able to use it. And it's got a really cool perk that you can update the images offline. You can essentially find one of your images, use one of their tools, and run like Windows Update against it. Against an offline image that's just a file sitting on your hard drive, you can patch it. That's a pretty cool trick. The only real con to ImageX is it's not block level. I would like to say it's like a glorified zip file, meaning there's no underlying partition, there's no underlying file system and master boot record and so forth. So there's just a couple of extra steps that it takes to create that file system, whereas with the block level, you don't have to do it. Again, as I said earlier, it is irrelevant which one you choose, whatever you are most comfortable with. If you're on the fence and you're not sure, just use ImageW. It's just a little bit easier, a little bit more built in. You don't have to go and grab some tools. The next component that you need to worry about is the drivers for hardware-independent imaging. So hardware-independent imaging gives us the ability to not have to have images for every single operating system, or rather every single piece of hardware. You know, this very specific, you know, Latitude laptop I need to have an image for. No, I can have a single image for everything. There's two models to that. We have the manual method and the automatic. The manual method is relatively simple. So here over in your driver management, you simply go and put your drivers in a very specific location. So here's the location. You probably already have a driver repository somewhere that you know, you were installing drivers by hand. You can simply point it at that particular repository, and it will go and index that and pull up all of the INFs and so forth to understand what drivers need to go on what systems. And we'll show you later in provisioning when that actually kicks in, but it's just going to go and index it. You can see I have 135,000 drivers that have been indexed inside of my repository. So that's a manual way of doing it. They've come up with an automatic method in part of our patch management process. That if you open up your patch management download function, there's actually a section up here called drivers. So if we just scroll up there, you'll see that we have the ability to choose any kind of set of drivers from HP and Dell and Lenovo and so forth. I'm not sure why my window won't scroll up, but trust me, it's up there at the top. I have a screenshot of what it looks like. Over here, you just select the models that you want. If you're an HP shop, you can check all at HP. It'll download those drivers and store them on the server. Next, we have the drivers for HI assignment, where you can manually go and assign drivers. So this automatic detection from downloading these drivers, that's a pretty good process. Let's say that it gets 95% of the devices taken care of. That last 5% is going to be, you know, it's going to be stubborn. It's going to be obnoxious. So with this assignment, it gives you the ability to kind of override the system and tell it to do something very specific. So we jump over here. You can see we open up our assignment window. Now, I don't have a lot of devices in my inventory, so I only have VMware devices. But you would see, you know, Dell and HP and Lenovo and all the different applications and the makes and models in here. And you would pick the operating system. So let's say for a VMware virtual platform, when it's Windows 10, maybe if I find a particular device, let's say if I find this particular video card, I want to do something. Oftentimes, it ends up being a package. Maybe you have an install package. You know those obnoxious drivers that you can't just point it to the INF. You actually have to run setup.exe to be able to do it. This is where you can do an actual installer, and it will put the right drivers in the right place. So if we find this particular, and it even shows the device ID down here in the bottom, then I want to manually install this particular application. That's how we can do some manual assignment. But like I said, 95% of it is going to be automatic. So let's jump over and let's kind of go through this entire process. Let's see what it looks like if I wanted to start from pretty much nothing and be able to have a Windows 10 deployment image by the end of our webinar here. So I do have some prefabricated ones that we can kind of reference, but I want to show you what it looks like, to build it from scratch. So first of all, what do I need to start doing this process? I've already talked about Pixie. Let's say my Pixie is already set up. I need to be able to do the preferred server. That's already set up. Now I need to capture an image. Now, for capturing an image and deploying an image, they've given us two very easy templates, and there's no reason not to use these because you can even tweak them to your own delight. So what would we do? We would hit Capture Template to start with. So I need to give it a name up at the top. I'm going to call it Webinar Capture. I'm going to use ImageW. Like I said, it's just a little bit easier. There's ImageX, but we're just going to choose ImageW. And it says, where is this particular image going to go? Well, I don't even type it in. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to make sure that it's correct. I always like to do this so that I don't have any typos. I actually just go and copy the path. So normally what I do is under the images folder, I'll come up and make a folder called incoming. This is where my images are going to get plopped down into. So I'm going to copy that folder. I'm going to paste that in here, and then we're going to hit create. We need to specify a actual image name. So we're going to use a variable. There's a variable called ld host name %.tbi. TBI is the file extension for ImageW. You don't technically have the file extension, but it makes it a little bit easier to understand what it is. Now, what is that variable? What does %ld hostname % really mean to us? Well, let's open up our public variables and find out. Variables are a way to substitute pieces of data at the runtime for that particular machine. So you can see we have a built-in variable here called ld hostname. Unfortunately, it is case sensitive, so make sure that H is uppercase. And you can see what value it looks at. In this case, it goes and looks at the computer display name. So if you open up an inventory item, we are able to see the display name. Right there is display name. Now, actually, out of the box, this is not set to display name. It is set to device name. That can cause some funny issues with devices that have never existed on your network. If you Pixie boot a machine and it's never been on your network, let's pretend it's a brand new machine out of the box, it shows up as simply a MAC address. This is a mini scan. It's very, very little information that shows up, and it will show up right here. If we scroll down, you'll notice that device name is actually missing. So I went and changed that over from device name to display name because that's a lot more accurate version of what's going to show up for those machines that are showing up as just a Pixie scan and a mini scan and just show up as the MAC address. So public variables, potentially go in here and change this from device name to display name. Okay, let's see what this does. It was a nice, neat wizard for us, but let's look at the actions that it does inside the provisioning process. So, quick comment on the 5 different phases. There are 5 different phases of a migration. Number 1, system migration. We'll talk about this later when we get into things like profile migration. That is done before we even reboot into Pixie or we vboot. It is just done to maybe gather information about the machine as part of migration. Most likely capturing the profile. That's the biggest thing that we're going to do at this particular stage. The next stage is after we've already booted up into our Windows PE environment, we do things that happen before the image gets laid down. In this case, there's an action called ensure the operating system is mounted as C. There's an action here that just automatically assigns the partitions, gives us a little bit more data down here, and it's just going to take care of kind of that partitioning process. It's going to really just make sure that since we're capturing it, when we go to capture and it says point at C colon is the right operating system drive, and it's not that 100 megabyte partition at the start that has the master boot record and things like that. It'll be the right partition. Next, it says capture the image. Again, we're using ImageW. Here's the path that we typed in. Now, it went and put all this data in there for us. Now, you can go and look in the documentation and look at all the different settings and so forth and compression levels, and there's a bunch of command line switches in here you can play around with and tweak and change. We're not necessarily going to do that today. I feel that the default's actually pretty darn good. I don't have to change it very often. If you ever make any changes up here, you can always hit validate. It will recreate these command line parameters based on the data that it has already, so that in case you screw it up, you can kind of hit validate up there. Okay, so to capture an image, it was simple as that. New template, capture template. Now we've created one called webinar capture. Now, how would we go through the process? Well, I happen to have a Windows 10 machine here that apparently went to sleep, so let's see if we can make it wake up. Let's just open that console one more time. So this Windows 10 machine doesn't have anything particularly special about it. It's just the operating system installed. And it's not in in the domain. There's nothing really unique about it. Now, we could have an entirely separate webinar to go through and talk about the tweaks that you could make to this, and cleaning it up, and purging data out that's unnecessary and so forth. There's a lot of kind of tips and tricks you can find out on the web on how to do that. It doesn't have to be specific to Ivanti products. It can be about essentially any product out there that does imaging. Those same kind of things would apply. Now, we need to run something called sysprep. Sysprep is the ability to take the sensitive data and strip it out. I'm talking about things like the SID, the computer name, user information. We don't want those in our image, so we're going to run sysprep. Here you can see where it lives. See Windows System 32 sysprep, and then there's an application called sysprep. You run that as administrator, and it's going to pop up in this little box right here. Now, what you want to do is you want to check that box that says generalize. We want to have the out-of-the-box experience. You've probably seen that before. Right after an install, it pops up and says, hi, let's get this set up. What settings do you want, et cetera, et cetera. That's the out-of-box experience. Generalize is going to strip that unique data out so that it doesn't even have a computer name when it starts up. It doesn't have user accounts. It's not in a domain. All that information is dropped out. Now, the reboot options here are, really depends on how you want to do it. Here is the overall view. As soon as this application is completed, we need to shut down the computer, and we need to boot it up on the network with Pixie, and we need to capture it. We don't want the machine to actually boot up back into Windows because it's going to run that out of the box experience. So I don't care which one of these options you choose. Quit is convenient if you want to, if you're going to walk away from the machine. That way you want to come back and see when it's done and shut it down yourself. Reboot is a little dangerous because if you're not paying attention, it'll boot back up and start running the out-of-box experience. Shutdown is kind of a nice happy medium where it'll just shut down and then you're in charge of turning it back on. I think I'm fast enough, so I'm going to do reboot. So we're going to press OK on that. Now, what's going to happen is it's going to pop up with this. It's going to talk about this prep. It's going to run through the process. It's going to go through that generalization and strip out that unique data about this particular machine. And because I chose the drop-down box of reboot, it's actually going to reboot the computer. And I'm going to try and be fast enough and hit the, in this case, we're doing it in VMware. You hit escape and tell it to do a network boot. Now, you can feel free to run your images in VMware. A lot of people find that very convenient to be able to do it and take snapshots and so forth. There's no reason you can't capture it on VMware and then deploy it out to physical machines. The one thing you probably don't want to do is install the VMware tools because you don't need VMware tools on a physical machine. So don't put the VMware tools or anything that you wouldn't want on all of your machines out in the world inside of this particular image. So we're just going to kind of let that run here for a second. Now's a good time maybe to, if anyone has some questions, go ahead and type them in. I can answer any of those or grab the pizza if you haven't got it yet. Looks like we are getting close here, so it should reboot any second now. Apologize, I should have timed this and saw how long this is going to take and had something else to talk about. All right, so remember we said where that image is going to go. It's going to go into that incoming folder. Since we used that provisioning variable, oh, there's our restart, It's going to use the name, I think the name, well, this is the name of the VM. I don't know what the name of the actual workstation was. We'll kind of have to see what it looks like. All right, so we're restarting. I'm going to go in here and say network boot. This is that PXE boot process. That other machine should pick up and offer me PXE boot. I press F8. I go down here to the Windows PE provisioning. It's going to download the WinPE. You know, it's something like 150-ish megabytes to the from the PXE representative down to the machine, boot up into that operating system. In these later versions, you know, especially like 2017.3, the Windows PE is based on Windows 10. That's not technically a requirement, and you can do it with older versions. We could use the Windows 7 PE to image Windows 10, but, you know, again, I always like to be on the latest version. All right, so let's let that PXE boot up. While this is happening, I'll talk about a slightly different way to get into this environment. It's a process called vboot. So PXE is me at the BIOS level telling it to boot from the network. Vbooting is a way to actually get the image out onto an operating system that's up and going. So let's say you have a machine that's up and going and the user's using today. I don't have to go out and have them press F8. I can actually send this Windows PE image down to their machine and tell their master boot record, hey, don't boot to normal Windows next time, boot off of this. So that's called a vboot, and we're going to hit that a little bit later. That's kind of next part of the process. So that makes it so that you don't have to have physical hands on the keyboard. So first thing that provisioning does is it kind of pops up and says, you know, hey, what kind of provisioning template do you want to run? We're going to log in. You can take away this login box if you really wanted to, but, you know, we're wiping out machines, so some people don't want to have that too readily available to users. So let's go down here into our public. We created a webinar, and we have webinar capture, so we're going to kick that off. So what that's going to do is those actions, it's going to mount the hard drives, it's going to kick off the image W, it's going to start capturing that image. We're not going to sit around and watch it capture the whole image, but that's kind of the process that it takes to get to that particular point. So mounted partition, you can see it's ensuring the OS is mounted as C. Notice on the back end, we're just doing things like disk part, you know, running disk part scripts to kick that process off. And as soon as that finishes, it's going to kick off image W. It's going to be the image capture window, and that image will start sucking up and being put on our endpoint manager server in that directory that we created called incoming. So let's not sit there and watch that. Let's kind of skip like a cooking show and say that that part's already been finished, and let's look at our server. Here's our incoming. That's where the image is going to come and land. But I already cheated and I built one already. So here's my Windows 10 .tbi pre-built image that we have that I built a different day. Off of that, actually, the same machine, just I sysprepped it. Okay, so we capture the image. We need to do sysprep with a generalize. We need to grab that image. Okay, now we need to start doing the process of deploying it. So we're going to go back in here into our webinar folder here, and I'm going to create a deploy template, deploy image template. So what does that look like? Let's go in here and say something like deploy Windows 10. I'm going to call this webinar, so all of our webinar stuff is together. I'm going to use image W. It's going to ask me what the path is. Well, the path is not incoming anymore, and it even lets me browse out and I think find it right here. Yep. Oh, that's LD log on. Let's go to Win10 TBI. Now it's going to do cool things like actually install the agent. So it's going to ask me which agent that I want to install. I'm just going to do my default Windows configuration. And it's going to ask me about the unattend script. Let's talk about that a little bit more in depth as soon as I hit save on this. I'm also going to do hardware independent imaging. So I'm going to check that box that says use hardware independent imaging. So what is the unattend.xml file? So we already talked about the fact that when I generalize an operating system, I remove all unique components. I strip everything out, the name, the domain, the users, all of that unique stuff I have ripped out and thrown away. So how is the computer going to know what its name is? You know, I don't want to have to pop up and ask for the name or things like that. I want to automate that. So there is an unattend.xml, which is an answer file to sysprep. So sysprep knows the answers to certain questions like, what is my name? Things like that. There's a prefabricated one that Ivanti is going to give you, which is part of the endpoint management product, or you can go create your own. As you scroll through here, you can see things like, what am I going to set the password to? Normally, you wouldn't have the password in plain text. You'd go and change that to false, and they have a little encryption tool to have it be encrypted here and not in plain text. Log on count is important. I want it to automatically log onto the computer 2 times. That way, it can, you know, go through the process and you know, continue with some provisioning steps, and I don't have to manually log in. What work group or domain am I going to be in? Notice this just says work group. We're actually going to join it as part of a different process. We have the computer name somewhere in here, and it's going to be based on a variable. So here's that same variable that we talked about before, %LD host name %. That's what I have under computer name. Okay, so I don't really need to change this unless, I think out of the box, the only couple of things that I do is auto log on, change the auto log on, and, you know, put in the password, things like that. So it's going to inject that script. Well, what does that really mean? Let's edit our template, and you can see if we go here into the post OS installation, right here it injects the unattend.xml file. What it's going to do is going to take that script and it's going to put it under the folder called C Windows Panther unattend.xml, and then sysprep knows to look in that location, look for a file called unattend.xml, and then pick it up. It actually looks in a couple of different places. You can even like put it on the root and then look for one there. Make sure you don't have another unattend.xml file in your image. If so, it could potentially use that one instead of the one that you're going to inject. So don't put unattend.xml in the image. A lot of other products have it, you do it that way. We don't want that in there because we want to execute it at runtime. And we're going to change things. Every unattend.xml file is going to be different in our organization because we use those variables for things like the computer name. So what are other actions that are going to happen here in pre-OS, OS, and post-OS? Well, first of all, it's going to create the default partitions. You know, it's just an action called create default partitions. Then it's going to deploy the image. You know, here's the image name. It's image W. It says version 2. We have a version 1. There's no reason to really use that anymore. So just make sure you're always using image WV2. Down here at the bottom are all the command line parameters. You're probably not going to be tweaking them and changing them. You can always hit validate to make sure that they're correct. So after we've deployed the image, again, make sure that things are mounted properly. We want the C drive to be the C drive. We want to be able to, you know, talk to that. So when we inject it to C://, it's the right hard drive that we're putting it on there. And then here's where hardware independent imaging kicks in. There's not much you really have to turn on. You just have to say go. And what it's going to do is it's going to, inside that Windows PE, it's going to execute a process. It's going to look through all the devices. It's going to look up what devices are, ask the server and say, hey, I found, you know, device ID XYZ. Do you have a driver for it? Yes, you do. Here's the driver. I'm going to put that driver in a certain location so that when Windows boots up, it knows to look for the driver in that particular location. You don't have to check that box for UNC. Otherwise, it just downloads it over HTTP. It doesn't really matter which one you use. UNC is just, you know, slightly faster. And then you can, you know, force unsigned drivers. This is a problem if you have drivers that are not signed and you have security policies associated with it, so you can do some forcing right there. The last thing is configure target OS. This is just some kind of back-end black magic that we need to do in order to continue our provisioning. So think about it. The agent that we, the image that we captured, we generally don't want to have the agent installed on it. So if there's no agent on it, how in the world is that image going to know to wake up after it's been deployed and call back to our server and continue to do the process? Well, it won't. Configure Target OS installs a small provisioning agent on it and gives us the ability to continue on once the machine has booted back up. So here's some additional tasks that are going to happen. Remember, the system configuration phase is after we have booted up and come back into the operating system. It's going to install the Landisk agent. It's going to do some more hardware-independent imaging. This is where it's going to catch maybe some of those drivers that are forced to be installed instead of just pointing at the INF files. In this case, it's going to force a policy sync. Maybe there's policies that says, hey, everyone in the accounting department needs to have application X. It would force that to happen. And then it's going to install map software. Let's talk about that when we get to our application migration phase. So there's all of the steps that it does as part of deploying a image. Now, I simply use this as, a stepping stone to, get even more customization. So that's maybe going to be our first step, but let's start stacking on top of this. What other things would you potentially want to do as part of your provisioning? Everyone on the webinar here knows today installing the OS is just the simplest of the tasks. It's everything else that's difficult. So I would want to do things like join it to the domain. So I'm going to create a template here called webinar join domain. I'm going to edit that, go into the system configuration, add an action. The action is going to be called join the domain. And I'm going to join a domain. The domain name, Vertrillo, is my fake company name. OU, if I wanted to put it in a particular OU, I could. If I wanted to use a username and password. Now, here's what's great. I can use variables. I can say something like username, %username, %, and then check that box for variables and password, and then %password, %. Why would I do that? Why would I use variables? Well, how often do the security team make us change our username and passwords for scripts and for service accounts? If they're going to make us change it on a regular basis, I can then come over here to my tools and my public variables, and I can create, I already have created one. I have a variable called username, and the string is called administrator, and I have a variable called password, and it's actually sensitive data. If you choose sensitive data, it'll just turn it into stars. And I put my password in there. The great part about that is I might have 10 different provisioning templates that reference the username and password. If I have to change that password, I only have to replace it in one location there in my variable. So that's the action for join domain. What other actions would I maybe need to do? What if I want to install some basic applications? Let's say that everyone has Chrome, just for example's sake. I'm going to say webinar install Chrome. In the system configuration phase, I'm going to add an action called distribute software. Now, let's say that I've already gone and created the package to install Chrome. In this case, I have. But let's leverage that so that we can simply say, as part of this process, I want to, I want to install Chrome. This could be, your VPN client and your antivirus and things that are going to be very common across your organization would be probably a better example of what that looks like. What other things do I do when I build a machine? Well, I need to patch the machine. Patch system. So let's edit that. System configuration. We're going to add an action, and we have patch system. Now, before I do that, notice all the other things that we have. We can do lots of things at this stage. You can control service. Maybe you want to stop the antivirus service while you're doing a bunch of stuff so things get installed faster. Maybe you need to create a directory or pop up and ask for what you want this machine to be named. I said, hey, I wanted to automatically name my machine. Maybe you want it to be automatically named, or excuse me, not automatically, but manually, and you want a technician to have it pop up and name it Bob's computer, and then it'll kind of go on from there. Maybe you want to execute a file, inject a script, install services, lots of goodies that we have in here, so you don't have to know how to really script anything. You just choose from this drop-down box. I said we want to patch the system, so let's choose patch system. Several different options. I'm a big fan of maybe just saying scan only. Let's just look for what's out there right now. That could also kick in if you have autofix enabled. And then you could choose which scan and repair settings you want to use. I personally like to create a verbose scan and repair settings that pops up and gives you information. The reason I like to do that is I want to be able to see that it's running. Maybe when it's actually sitting on an end user's desk, you're not going to have it display when you run a full scan. But this, you're provisioning, you want to see, instead of just the provisioning window sitting there and saying, what's going on? Is anything happening? You would see in front of that the verbose scanning window, and you say, oh, it's going through its patch scan. That's what's happening at this particular process. Okay, so there we have it. We have kind of the different actions that we've created: installing applications, joining the domain, doing those various functions. We can then start kind of putting them together. So if I want to create a new template, I'm going to say something like webinar basic Windows 10. And I'm going to start including them. The idea behind that is I'm linking the templates together. I click on Edit. I'm going to go to the Include section right here, and I'm going to say Include, go down to my webinar, and then I'm just going to start picking them. Well, yes, I want to deploy Windows 10. What else do I want to do? I want to install Chrome. What else do I want to do? I want to join the domain, and I want to patch the system. So they're now included. Did I not pick the right one? They're now included as a link inside of this particular template. And if we go to the actions template, or excuse me, the actions list, you can see the order that it's going to do it. Now, it's going to be generally smart enough to do things like don't try and join the domain before we've imaged the computer, because we have the different phases of the installation. But there are kind of subsections in here, like once we get to system configuration, it was probably just the order that I added them. So you might need to go in here and kind of move them up and down, or better yet, you probably want to do things like this. Here we install the agent. I'm a big fan of rebooting here. So I'm going to go in and say reboot. I want to reboot the computer. I want the reboot to happen after the agent installs to make sure everything's okay before we go on to different processes. Maybe same thing with join the domain. Don't you have to reboot after you join the domain? Let's reboot right there. And so we can choose where these actions are. We just say kind of up and down. I don't think I chose the right option right there. Let's add that one more time. Oh, yep, I didn't use the drop-down box. You got to do the drop-down box, reboot, shutdown, call this reboot. I don't think I selected it here either. Yep, reboot, that's just the default option. That's what I want. I'm going to move that up so that after I join the domain, I reboot. So those are the actions and what order they're going to happen. I'm going to go ahead and press OK on that. Now, that is generally speaking the process that we do to do the operating system. And one thing you'll notice in our basic Windows 10, in the deploy Windows 10, it has this option up here at the top to vboot. This is the alternative to Pixie, and you can actually still Pixie boot. And if it's already in Pixie and it receives a vboot action, it tells it just to to skip past that and go to the next process. So now I have a template for doing a basic capture of that particular machine. So what would that look like to to an end user if I kick this off? Well, I have an end user right here. I have the ability to potentially run that. So let's go kick that off. Now we're going to use the one that I've already created. This is the cooking show trick where I'm going to show the one I pulled out of the oven already. Just to make sure I didn't make any typos or anything. Here I have my basic Win 10. Here's my machine for Windows 7. I'm going to drag that onto the template, and I'm going to tell that to start. Now, there's lots of different ways that you can make this happen. We're going to talk about a few others later. Right now, I'm just going to show you kind of the quick and dirty. If I wanted to command this machine to do it, what would happen? So on the end machine, what's going to happen is it's going to pop up with that provisioning window. It's going to copy down that vboot process. It's going to reboot the computer. It's going to kick into all of those steps that we said, from deploying the image to joining the domain to rebooting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just going to go and kick off here. We don't have to sit here and stare at this box because I'm going to talk about a couple of other things while that happens. But here's the provisioning image. If you didn't know this, they've actually changed quite a bit. You can customize a lot of the logos and coloring in these boxes. Don't leave the Ivanti logo there. No one knows what Ivanti is. They only sort of knew what Landesk was from an end user perspective. Now they really don't know what Ivanti is. So go into the branding section and change the colors and fonts and logos there. Put your information on there so they can understand, oh yeah, this is us. This is something that we as a corporation or organization are doing. So I recommend that you go and customize that. So it's copying down that image. It's going to reboot into Pixie and kick off and start just like this. When it was capturing, except it's going to kick off and do a deployment. Okay. I'm going to stop for a second and see if there's any questions on the provisioning process for the operating system up until this point. And James, I'll try and contact you offline. I have some good ideas for you, but maybe they're not pertinent for right now. So any questions anybody has up until this point?
I don't see any in there, Brian. Good chance for you to grab a bite of pizza there, though.
Yeah, my guess is everyone is eating the pizza. That's what's happening right now. So anyway, there's our machine. It's rebooting. It's going to go and kick off that process. Let's kind of check back on that here in a little bit. Let's go back and talk about the other parts of the puzzle. So what are the other parts of the puzzle? We have the applications. We won't get into the conversation today about what we're going to do with validation of applications. That's a different conversation altogether. We're going to assume that you've already validated those applications. There's lots of tools that Microsoft has as part of the kit that you go and get Image X, for example. The user state migration tool, they have an application validation program. So we're going to assume that you've already done that. We're just going to talk about how do we do the mechanics of getting applications onto the machines that are supposed to. Because remember, in both models of migration, both of them, the operating system is wiped out and the applications aren't there. Most people aren't doing an upgrade style methodology. They are doing the wiping out of the operating system. So we have this magic piece of the puzzle called mapping the software, installing map software. Let's kind of look into that and see how that works. There's our machine. It's gotten to V-boot. It is kicking off to deploy the image. We'll just keep checking on this as we go along. Okay, we have our machine here. We are going to look at the first component of that is actually in software license monitoring. So software license monitoring, for those who aren't aware, is just a way to keep track of the licenses associated with the licenses associated with how the products that you have implemented. We don't technically care about the licensing in this conversation, but we use this tool as part of it. So we're going to go down here into products, and we're going to go to the discovered section. Now, we need to map our software. If I found Office 2010 on a computer, install Office 2010. That's the logic behind the map. Well, we find it with software license monitoring. So go through this particular list of products, and when you find something that you care about, you just simply need to right-click it and say Add to Monitored Products. So let's see if there's anything sort of exciting in here that I could add. Okay, let's add Office Professional Plus 2013. So right-click, move to Monitored Product. So normally you'd go in here and start playing around with licenses and keeping track of whether you have enough licenses associated with it. I don't care about that for today's purposes. I just need to be able to have this discovery engine looking for applications on the machines. Now, a machine would have already had an inventory scan. For example, here, this was our machine in the past that we just kicked off the reimage on. Under software, software, add move programs, program, we already know what applications are installed on what computer. So we know what the machine looked like before we imaged it. Now we go back to our provisioning section and we say our product to package mapping. Well, before we do that, let me show you, the after effect. We need to have a distribution task for that particular piece of software. Our example was Office 2013. You need to have an Office 2013 distribution package. So, you need to have the installation source. You need to have maybe a MSP file. It's like an answer file, at least for Office. You point it to setup. You need to, use the associated files. So go through that entire process for software distribution, or hopefully that's already created and we can just simply leverage it. Now, back in operating system provisioning, we go into our product to package mapping. So this is where we're trying to create a mapping between what was on the computer and what we want to be on the computer. I think this GUI needs to be a little bit bigger to really get some good value out of it. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you can see these are the SLM products that we found. You can see my brand new one that I just added right there, Office Professional Plus 2013. So if we find Office Professional Plus 2013, I want to do the following action. I want to install a piece of software. Now, you don't have to do anything. You know, Adobe Air, I can just ignore it. Oh, I found Adobe Air. Who cares? Ignore it. Don't do anything. Or I can map it. So I just click right here. On the right-hand side, I go and pick the application that is associated with it. So, for example, Office 2013. I simply double-click on it. Now, you can do some interesting tricks in here. You do not have to do a one-to-one mapping. For example, what if you want to say, oh, we don't do Office 2010 anymore. Our ELA gives us access to Office 2013 or 2016. You can install a newer version. You are not required to install the same version, so you could simply map it. You know, hey, if you previously had this, then do the following set of actions. You can also do lots of complicated things with distribution packages, because we can link our distribution packages together. What if you have 3 accounting applications? You could link them together as dependent packages, and then you could say, if we find one of the accounting pieces of accounting software, install all 3, so we don't have to go necessarily map it across and have everything show up in our software license monitoring. So that's the product to package mapping. Once you have that mapping in place, what you do is you tell provisioning that you want to do that as part of the process. So we go in here and we say create a new template. We're going to call it webinar underscore map software. And I'm going to edit that. System configuration, add action. I'm going to add the action called install map software. Now, there's really nothing to do. There's no actions on the right-hand side, any decisions that I need to make. I just simply say install map software. It is then going to look at the, the inventory associated with it and map that information across. And this is technically only useful on an in-place migration method. If you're doing it with a piece of new hardware, we actually don't have that previous logic unless we get tricky and do things like name it exactly what the old computer name was. Then we have the potential for pulling that information in. So this is most useful when we're doing an in-place upgrade. So now I would go back to my basic Windows 10, edit that, go to the include section, include public webinar map software. Go to my actions, see where that happens in the system. Patch system shouldn't be, or patch system should always be last, because this may install Office. I don't want to scan for it and then install Office and not have that data. So, always put patch system at the very end. You don't even technically have to do that. Most of the time, it'll just kick in and scan with a later date, just if you want to make sure you have a nice, clean, neat image going out the door. It just increases the time since that scan takes a little bit of time. Let's jump back over here, kind of see what's happening. Looks like our machine is in the process of deploying that image. It's got about 3 gigabytes left. It's been going for 6 minutes, time remaining 2, so that's just kind of going on and doing its thing. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. Okay, any questions on the application, so our map software, how SLM works, our product to package mappings? Doesn't look like we have any Q&A, so I will keep going on. Okay, so let's jump back to our presentation. All right, now let's talk about the hardest thing. I always save the hardest for the last one. I need to wow you with the easy stuff to begin with. So without a doubt, almost every customer that I've talked to has said this is the most challenging part of a migration is the user data. And that's a litany of reasons why this is. Users don't behave, they don't put the data where they're supposed to. There's lots of different challenges associated with it. But I will tell you that most of my customers say that if you can take even small strides to save their desktop wallpaper and bring that across, that means more to them than spending, 10 hours rebuilding something else. Sometimes it's the little things that users will appreciate. So don't underestimate that. In this day and age of, the consumerization of technology, where everyone thinks it should be as easy as opening up your phone and going to the App Store and hitting, download, and they have an application, or users upgrading their own operating system, they're always going to say, wow, you guys do it so much more difficult and it's harder to deal with than, just doing it myself. We need to be cognizant of that and try and do some nice things for the end user. So There's lots of different ways to get that data, of that user data, off of that machine before we image it, or to migrate it between two machines if we're doing the hardware replacement methodology. So we're going to, up until this point, we've kind of talked about, the one way to do it, and here's the best way. This is where it diverges, and there isn't a best way. There's different ways, and none of these are right or wrong. And I bet I could pick on one person on this webinar will say, no, that's the best method for our corporation, because everybody is unique. Okay, so there's three main methods of getting the user data off. First of all is something called Environment Manager. Now, Ivanti purchased a company called Appsense last year and have integrated several of the technologies into the Ivanti portfolio. Now, fair warning, if you're a previous LDMS or Ivanti Endpoint Manager customer, this is not a product that you get for free. This is something that you have to purchase. But I'm going to show you a little bit about how it works, and it is very cool technology. The one in the middle is the built-in profile migration / user state migration tool. This comes from Microsoft. This has a lot of documentation behind it. You can find lots of different tutorials on how to use it online. I say this is, you get what you pay for. Some people have fine success with it, other ones struggle. So, you can just kind of take that with a grain of salt on whether it will work great in your organization, considering the cost. And the last one is something called Transition. This is something brand spanking new. It's essentially a version of USMT on steroids, one that works a little bit better, has a lot more customization, and Landesk has signed an agreement with them to sell it as part of their Ivanti Endpoint Manager product. So you don't get it for free when you own Ivanti Endpoint Manager, but it is very low cost associated with it. But it just scans the profile and picks it up off on the machine and plops it down on the other machine. It's as simple as that. I'll show you a little bit about how that works. So I'll talk about these three methodologies and how they function. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit more about Environment Manager. So this comes from the Appsense portfolio. Think about your typical profile. Go to a profile of a Windows 7 machine. Take your typical user and open up C users and then the username. What information is in there that you actually care about? I like to give it an analogy, and you can see it on the screen here. Think about a cow. A cow is a big animal that has a lot of meat inside of it. And for those who don't know, the shank, that's the number 19 down there, is essentially the leg. It's, arguably the worst cut of meat that you can come up with. There's, since they walk around a lot and it's a very used muscle, it's very, tough and stringy. So you don't want to eat that, but everyone loves the filet mignon. So in a typical profile, there is a lot of shank. There's a lot of just absolute garbage data. Temporary this, extracted that. Really all you care about is one tiny sliver of that, one small cut of beef, the filet mignon, number 6 right up there in the sirloin section. That's what you care about. And it's things like, what is my email signature? What are the recent files that I've opened? Do I have a custom dictionary? What is my wallpaper set to? All the little things that users care about. They do not care about their, Internet Explorer cookie history necessarily. So you get to decide what you care about and what you want to have, what you would consider the right cuts of beef, because a lot of people say, oh no, number 12, I love brisket, cook it the right way, and that's something I absolutely want. Fine, great, let's grab that cut of beef while we're doing this. Now, how do we do it inside of Environment Manager? Well, how does a typical application and profile work? In this example, we have winware.exe, and it wants to talk to the file system, and it wants to talk to the registry. Microsoft applications use heavily on the registry. There is 8 million bazillion settings in the registry for different things, and it relies on that heavily for its personalization setting. File system has some information in there, but it reads that directly. Here is the magic of Environment Manager. When winware.exe opens, we actually send all reads and read requests for the file system and the registry through the Environment Manager agent. And we follow a process that says, if it's something we have included in that list, it's the filet mignon section, it's the section for recent files, it's the section for your custom dictionary, whatever it is that you care about, we're actually going to send that to the database. We have a SQL database we're going to store that data in on a server. And the other crap, the other garbage that we don't care about, we're just going to let that sit on the file system. So, the whole idea behind this is when they move computers, the environment manager agent is on that new computer. We don't technically have to transfer any data down to it. It simply says at runtime, I'm going to go get the juicy bits out of the database. And so that's how environment manager works. It's relatively simple to use. I have the console right here and kind of show you a little bit about more how it works. Right out of the box, it does most applications that you can think of. There's all the Windows personalization from, how the start menu works, the taskbar, the appearance, the desktop, cookie, history, blah, blah, blah. But then you can do things up here at the top like Microsoft Office 2010. So what it does is you go in here and say, when the following applications are executed, and you can see it's anything from, Excel, WinWord, PowerPoint, et cetera, and when it has a certain version, I want you to include this registry values as part of that database, and I want you to exclude these things down here. Now, you don't need to learn any of this. You don't need to know what any of this means. This was just imported, we call it a snippet. So on the Ivanti community, there's snippets for most applications that you use in the corporate world. So you don't have to go and train it to do anything. And this is effectively out-of-the-box functionality. Same thing on the folders. Look for these folders and include them in that magic database redirection. And here's junk. Don't put that junk in it. Then it does things like, well, if Outlook accesses OST or PST, don't include that. We don't want to store that in the database. Store that on the local machine, things like that. And so that really is the magic of Environment Manager. And the first time that I ever saw this, I said, well, hang on a minute. This is kind of crazy. That's just way too much data associated with it. You'd be surprised if we open up the personalization analysis here. Granted, this is just demo information. The Appsense team says, on average, when we store user data, it's usually only around 30 megabytes max of data that we store. That's all that we care about in a profile. The rest of it is absolute garbage. So you install an Environment Manager agent on a machine, and then it just magically talks to the server and does that redirection. Now, a question you probably have is, well, what about the files? What about the crap under My Documents? They got 10 gigs worth of junk there as well. We don't want to store that in the database. We consider that kind of a slightly different problem. We slice it in half with Environment Manager and say files are one problem, personalization is a separate problem. So the personalization is solved with that database functionality and the file director, which is, think of that like a version of Dropbox that synchronizes data between two locations. We can essentially say, take this information under My Documents and synchronize it to a new location. That new location could be the new computer. One cool thing they have is most organizations these days are getting into Office 365. As part of Office 365, you get OneDrive subscription. A lot of people have no idea what they're doing with that. They don't put any information in that yet. It just sits there and they're paying for it. This gives you the ability to actually synchronize the data to OneDrive, have that be the intermediary step between your two machines, and then it synchronizes it to the destination machine. This works great for the migration method of doing a hardware replacement, because it doesn't matter what that machine was, what their old machine was. It's already migrated to the cloud or to an on-premise server, and then just gets synchronized down to that new machine. Okay, let's go talk about the couple of other things. Well, let's go check on our image. That's not the right one. This is it right here. Okay, so we're already up to Windows 10. I don't see Chrome installed yet, so it's probably going through and processing some things on the back end, but there's our Windows 10 machine, so kind of chug along doing its thing. If you're ever curious, you can right-click on a machine, open up the provisioning history, and you can kind of see the different actions that have been happening. I actually had it fail. We could open up and see why that is. All of the different steps and actions, a green checkbox means that it worked. And, oh, in this case, we got a hardware independent imaging error. You know, this particular machine I reimaged, you know, 10 times over the last week. There's probably something wrong we did with it in terms of assigning packages. I think that's what it was. I went and assigned a VM package to it. From a troubleshooting perspective, I have a really cool trick to not have to recreate your work a lot. So running a provisioning task and having it fail, that's just part and parcel of the job. You're going to run it 10 times, 20 times, 50 times before you get it to work properly. This part takes a long time, deploying the image. I don't want to sit there and run through that again. So what I'll do is I'll come up here. The one that I ran was this one called Basic Windows 10. I'm going to clone it. So I have a copy of that, and then I'm just going to rename it. So I'm going to call it Webinar Test. And then you can condense it. Oh, actually, I should have done it, renamed this one up here, Webinar Test. That's going to collapse all of the actions down. No, let's not rename it. That's going to collapse all the actions down into a single template. It no longer links to those other templates. And I'm just going to go and purge the things that work just fine. Oh, this worked. This worked. All of this stuff was working just fine. Nope, I don't care about this. I don't care about this. I did this. It succeeded. If you remember when we opened up that provisioning history, all of this stuff worked just fine. So I simply go through here and delete, 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 and the hardware independent imaging, I don't care about that. It's VM anyway, it doesn't matter. Here's the steps that it actually needs to do. So then I'll just go and drag this Win7 machine and drop it on the webinar test, and then go and kick that off right now. So that way I don't have to rerun through the entire process. I can troubleshoot it from where I go, and then I can find a problem and say, oh, it turns out what I did was I did X, Y, Z in the wrong order, then go back to the original one, the basic, because that hasn't been touched since I cloned it, and it's going to, and I have the ability to mess with that one and not with the one that, this one that I was deleting all the tasks on. Okay, so the couple of other profile migration processes that we have, like I said, two different models behind that. So the first is the user state migration tool. Now, this is something that comes from Microsoft, is fairly well documented, and you can download a lot of sample data off the internet. You can download a tool that gives you some different creation tools and so forth. And you can see that it's just an XML file that does things like this. You know, look for the My Music path, and we're going to grab that My Music, shared music, et cetera, et cetera. As you scroll down here, it has all the different kind of functions and different personalization out there, as well as files. You would simply customize this to your liking. This is the way that I want it to work. I want it to you know, look for this data, not look for other data, and it would store that onto like a file share. And we can create that with a new template. We can create an action in here. You can see, no, let's not do it there. Webinar capture profile. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. We would do it in the system migration phase because we're doing it before the operating system ever kicks in and before PE does anything. We have capture profile that uses the user state migration tool. You just point to that XML file, point to where you want it to store that, or you can do more complicated things. Other customers say, well, that's great and all, but I want to use my own custom third-party tool. Great, no problem. You can go into add action. You could do, you know, to execute a script, you know, execute file. You could copy that file down to start with inject script. You could stop services ahead of time if you want to. So lots of different options you can do in order to do that. So you could say capture profile, go put that information in here, and then save this template, and then go add it to our webinar basic Windows 10, so that when you drag that machine onto it, remember this machine over here, the first thing that it did was boot into, it did a vboot. Well, one step before that would be capture the profile. As you can see, we're picking up where we left off. We're joining the domain. We're doing those next actions. We can kind of see that finish. Okay, so that's how user state migration tool works. Like I said, your mileage may vary. Some people love it. Some people hate it. It is what it is. We have another tool. This is brand new, and it's called Transition with an X. It actually comes pre-installed on your core server. If you don't want to know where it's at, it is core server name, LD logon, transition, right there. Now, this only applies to 2017.3 and newer. Older versions didn't have this, but you can just as easily get it from Ivanti. We can download it. You do have to purchase this software. This is not free, but you can install it as a trial to play around with it. So the Migration Manager ends up installing on the server right here, and you can open up Migration Manager, and I can run Migration Manager. Now, you can run it by hand, which that's good to kind of get a feel on how it works, but you're going to end up scripting this so that it runs automatically on the end machine. So you can go in here and choose what you want to copy. Oh, I want to copy the logged in user's profile, and I want to extract, I don't care about Lotus Notes or Firefox, but I do care about their iTunes, and you just kind of go through in here and check all the stuff that you do care about. Here you can have things like, printers and all these different personalization. We have file rules, so you can come up here to your file rules here and say things like, well, I want to include the path called users, whatever the variable for username is, my docs or something like that. And you can map that to where you want it to go, and it would copy those files. So it can do the personalization stuff and the files with those file rules. When you're ready, you simply say save as. This is going to save an XML file, like I have an example right here that I've spit out. And then what you do is you're not actually going to run this GUI as part of the provisioning job. No, I don't want to save that. You're actually just going to run this Migration Manager with some command line parameters. And if you open up the guide, here in the automation guide, it tells you how to do it. We won't go through all the nitty-gritty details, but you essentially just run the Migration Manager, and then, in this case, /auto inject, and then you'd put a parameter on it. We would just go in here in our template, and we would say deploy no, we want to say webinar deploy transition. And you would edit that in the actions here, say, to execute a file. And, we could just reference where that was, images, profiles, transition, and then my migration manager.exe, and then there's the command line parameters of inject, et cetera, et cetera. You need to go through the work of making sure the parameters and so forth are correct in here. But you're probably going to need to do things like specifying variables. At one point you're going to have to say something like LD host name, because you're going to need to reference where the computer came from. Oftentimes when we're doing profile capture, you'd think it captures it by name. Most of the time it captures it based on the host name, what device that it came from, not the user itself. So you may need to specify a parameter like the LD host name in there. So that's the transition product. Like I said, there's 3 different ways to skin this cat. I can't tell you the right way. I can just tell you options. If any of these kind of tickle your fancy, I would never say that we're USMT experts. It kind of, if you can't get it to work, it's probably not going to work. Most people can figure it out. But if you ever want to know more about transition, or specifically Environment Manager does 27 other really cool things like automation of creating printers, and everything a login script would do. You can do it in a nice, neat GUI and do it on a user base or group base, or lots of cool stuff that Environment Manager does, as well as the other stuff in the Appsense suite. So if you're ever curious about that, let us know. We're happy to show you more about how that works. Couple of things I want to show you to kind of make it a little bit fancier. We've talked about relatively basic stuff up until this point. How can you start to get a little bit fancier once the basics are working? Here I have my final builds. I have a basic Windows 10. I had a customer just the other day that says, hey, you know what, we're just too nervous. We don't know about the machine that runs, that we're capturing from. Users sometimes do dumb stuff. Oh, I put all my documents on C:\/ or another, and our profile script didn't go and grab that. So if that's the case, they wanted to capture an image of every single machine before they wiped it out. So you can do that. Here's our basic process, just tweaked a little bit. We do a vboot, we mount the hard drive, and we capture an image. we capture the image, we save it as LD hostname. This is not sysprep, this is not generalized. This is going to be a big fat image of how that machine lived. And then we're going to turn right around and we're going to wipe that out and we're going to put down our Windows 10 image. So you're just going to have this incoming directory full of images for the machines that you've migrated. And then there's actually a viewing tool that you can use to crack open those images if you wanted to go in and look at them and pull out files so you don't have to re-image the whole machine back down. So, so that's one way you can get a little bit more complex, is capturing the image ahead of time. You can do other stuff where you can keep building on this. What if you want to go in here and say, back in my webinar, I'm going to create a new template here that is webinar laptop. Well, what's unique about laptops? Well, a laptop is a basic Windows 10, and then it's something else. Do all of that stuff, but also install the VPN software. We don't have VPN on desktop, so we can say install VPN software. Go down here to distribute software, say OK, and go and find the application. I don't have VPN here, we just pretend, and pick that. You could stack on that on top of that accounting and install the accounting applications, or you know, the variations are limitless. I have one customer that's in education that has, you know, 100 final builds for different classrooms and different schools and different configurations. So kind of the sky's the limit. You can keep kind of stacking these up and up and up and up. Okay, quick question. Where the core server is the migration manager located again? The installer is in the directory called, well, it's in the LD logon folder, which is a share. So it's, oh, no, it's C, program files, LANDesk, management suite, LD logon, transition. So that's the path that it's in on your core server. Again, 2017.3 and later. Older versions don't have it. If you don't want to upgrade and you just want that software, just let us know. We can get your hands on it. Again, you're going to pay for a license for it, but I heard it was very cheap. Quick comment on that. This is great if you just need an ad hoc solution to migrate. Environment Manager is a little bit better if you want a long-term strategy for managing profiles and users and people moving around. Because then the next time it comes up, or you're wiping out the machine, or you know, we upgrade to Windows 11 or whatever happens in the future, that information is already kind of off the machine. Okay, one of my favorite things to show off, which it's a pretty new agey thing. It's like all those companies that have Genius bars in the office. It's a pretty radical idea. Is self-service. Let's let the end user have a choice when they're upgrading Windows 10. Let them be in charge. You know, they think they're in charge anyway, so let's hand them the keys and let them do it. So how would we do that? First of all, we go into distribution packages, and we're going to create a package. Let's just go in here, new, and the package is going to be a universal package, and it's going to be provisioning. And we're going to call this webinar Windows 10 migration. Down here in the provisioning template, we pick our provisioning template. So you're going to have to do all that work we've done up until this point, like, for example, basic Windows 10. And you need to fill out the metadata. Now, I've already done that. Let me show you the one I've already done so it looks a little bit more exciting. So I created a software distribution task. I say it's from Microsoft. It's going to take 60 minutes. There's a category if you want to put a category. I have a logo for it. I have a screenshot for it so that it can show up in the software deployment portal. So what does that look like? Here in the Ivanti Workspaces application, there's another machine that I have. Before we do that, how did it get there? Well, I needed to go and create a scheduled task. So I created a scheduled task called Windows 10 Migration, and that migration has the task of the distribution package of Windows 10 Migration. Under targets, I create a query, like in this case, upgradable Windows 10. I created a query of everyone that is below Windows 10 and upgrade eligible. You know, they have enough RAM, they have enough CPU, etc. And I target them. Then you go here under task settings, you say it's a policy. Under portal settings, you say that it's recommended. You usually don't let them run it as desired. As soon as they're upgraded to Windows 10, take it out of their portal because you don't want them to click on it again. But I like to repeat it over and over again, so I kind of leave it in there. And what does that look like to an end user? Well, here's my software catalog. I have a, install Office 2010, and I have Windows 10 migration. So I can click on it. I can see a little bit more about it. I must have detargeted that particular machine. But all it would take is the user clicks this install button, and what happens on the back end? It just kicks off a provisioning job from, just like we drug that machine down onto it. It's not more complicated than that. If you've already done the work to create the provisioning job, the next component is easy. It just kicks off and sends that provisioning job out there. Software deployment portal, I think it's a really cool new agey way. I'd like to see some customers come back and say, yeah, we offered it to our users to see, who could do it on their own. Here's our machine that we were migrating. Let's go and log in here to it. See what it looks like. We can go in here into the process and look at that provisioning history and see if it completed successfully. Whoops, not that. Provisioning history. So there's our webinar task. It looks like it's still running, but it kicked through and did the majority of the different functions and got us out there. And there's our, it's still setting up the profile for that machine, but we're pretty darn close to that being completed. Okay, I got a question here. What is the oldest model PC that has ever been successfully installed on Windows 10? I don't have an answer to that. I was a deployment engineer for Landis for many, many years, but now I'm on the pre-sale side, so I do a lot of conversations like this. So I don't get my feet wet as much as I used to. So I'll kind of put it out there to everyone else if anyone else wants to chime in with any comments on that in the Q&A box, whether they, what's the oldest machine that they have been able to image. I assume that the requirements are relatively low. I looked it up when I wrote that query. It's like 1 gig of RAM and 1.5 gigahertz processor or something. I mean, really, it's the requirements are extremely low. I'm a little bit more concerned about the opposite problem. If you haven't looked into it, Kaby Lake. Kaby Lake is the new architecture from Intel. There's been a lot of hubbub about it, that it's going to only support Windows 10. You cannot install anything older on it. And what does that mean? What are the problems kind of associated with it? So that's kind of our process going along. You can see there's our Word. We had we had told it to do the install map software. We didn't have Word in our image, but here we have Word on our new machine because it did the installing of map software, and it saw I had Word before, or it saw I had Office before, and it actually upgraded. I think our old version was Office 2010. It installed Office 2013 for this particular machine. Okay, so back to the presentation. I think that's pretty much everything that I had. We had some okay Q&A as we kind of went along, so I don't think we need to stop and ask if anyone has any further questions. I'll just put it out there that if you do have any questions, please just hit me up or hit your salesperson up. They'll be happy to help you out with more services if you need it. We have a great Windows 10 migration jumpstart kit where we come on site and we help you set up a lot of this stuff. It can get a little tricky. We talked about a lot of the simpler stuff today. There's a lot of kind of nitty-gritty details that need to get worked out. Our engineers are doing this all the time, so they have very good experience with it. So we have a Windows 10 Jumpstart package that's just a service that would come on site or remotely and help you get your environment up and going so you can kind of kickstart your Windows 10 migration. I'm sorry I ran down your clock. Now you only have 788 days, 11 hours, 6 minutes, and 15 seconds before you need to upgrade to Windows 10. So apologize for stealing that time from you, but hopefully this gets you set on the right track to to be able to do these migrations over the next little bit. So I appreciate everyone attending. We did record this webinar. We're going to put it up on our YouTube channel, and you will get an email link of that after the fact, so you can kind of rewind and go to the parts that I was kind of maybe going a little bit too fast through. So make sure to kind of take a look at that, but it for sure will be on YouTube here in a little bit. So again, thank you everyone for attending, and have a great day.